Welcome. I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm director of the Foley Institute. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to, this is the first in our series this semester on the future of liberal democracy. And I can think of no better person to kick that off than our guest today, who has written extensively about political orders and the declining neoliberal political order, and is now working on a new book about the coming political order, what may come for a political order. So I'm very excited for our guest and to hear the conversation today. Gary Gerstle is a Mellon Professor of American History, Emeritus, and was the Director of Research at the University of Cambridge. He was also a visiting scholar at the Harvard-Radcliffe Institute this past year. And next year, he will hold the Klug Chair in American Law and Governance at the Library of Congress. Dr. Gerstle is the author or editor of more than 10 books, most recently The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, which was published by Oxford University Press, and which was shortlisted for the Financial Times Best Book of the Year award. And I'll just say it's probably a must-read for any serious student of American political economy. He is currently writing a new book, Politics in Our Time, Authoritarian Peril and Democratic Hope in the 21st Century, which will be published by Penguin Press. Dr. Gerstle is a fellow of the British Academy and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Join me now in welcoming Gary Gerstle to the
podium. Thank you, Cornell, for those wonderful remarks. Thank you, Richard, for doing so much to get me out here. Thanks to Tom Foley for giving his records to Washington State University and making this a place for serious investigation of American politics, past and present. It's my first trip here. I'm delighted to be here. I am a historian, which partially explains why I have no slides to share with you today. No political scientists, that's de rigueur now. But history, we have more leeway. I have spent the last 10 years in the UK, and part of what made that a fascinating experience for me was writing the history of my last book outside the UK. And it's a book that covers the last 100 years of American history. And I found it a really interesting and rewarding experience. And the book, I think, came out somewhat differently than it would have if I was writing it here. So I'm very grateful for the experience of being thrust into another nation and teaching American history to people who are not invested in American history the way Americans are. I found that to be a really valuable experience. And it took me about 2 or 3 years teaching there before I stopped using the royal we. Like, we went into Vietnam. I'm teaching, a couple hundred British students. We went into Vietnam. Well, they didn't go into Vietnam. And so I had to purge that sense of identity with my own past. And I had to render a history of a foreign country legible to a group of British students, and I think that made me a better historian. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity. I'm going to frame this talk around my last book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, and I want to introduce you to some of the concepts that underlie it, political order, neoliberalism. But everyone wants to know where we're going, where we are and where we're going, and I will have some remarks about that towards the end of my talk. I took a lot out of this talk when I learned that this was to be 30 minutes. I'm going to try and shrink it into 35. I might get to 37. I will beg your indulgence. But thank you for coming, and thank you for helping me to make sense of a country and a world going through an extraordinary transition. And I have become a historian of our time. That's what I've become. I feel compelled to do that, but I also am fully aware of the perils of writing a history of the present. Since when you're in it, you don't always know what from the moment endures and what's going to disappear. Across the second decade of the 21st century, the tectonic plate structuring American politics and life began to shift. Even before the pandemic struck, developments that 10 years earlier would have seemed inconceivable now dominated American politics and popular consciousness. The election of Donald Trump and the launch of a presidency like no other, the rise of Bernie Sanders and the resurrection of a socialist left, the sudden and deep questioning of open borders and free trade, the surge of populism and ethno-nationalism, and the castigation of once celebrated globalizing elites. The decline of Barack Obama's stature and the transformational promise that his presidency once embodied for so many. Remember that time? Seems like a long time ago now. And the widening conviction that the American political system was no longer working and that American democracy was in crisis. In this dizzying array of political developments, I discern the fall, or at least the fracturing, of a political order that took shape in the 1970s and 80s and achieved dominance in the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century. I call this political formation a neoliberal order. Ronald Reagan was its ideological architect. Bill Clinton was its key facilitator. The phrase political order is meant to connote a constellation of ideologies, policies, and constituencies that shape American politics in ways that endure beyond election cycles. In the last 100 years, America has had two political orders. The New Deal that arose in the 1930s and 40s, crested in the 1950s and 60s, and fell in the 1970s, and the neoliberal order that arose in the 1970s and 80s, crested in the 1990s and 2000s, and fell in the 2010s. At the heart of each of these two political orders stood a distinctive program of political economy. The New Deal was founded on the conviction that capitalism, left to its own devices, spelled economic disaster. It had to be managed by a strong central state able to govern the economic system in the public interest. The neoliberal order, by contrast, was grounded in the belief that market forces had to be liberated from government regulatory controls that were stymieing growth, innovation, and freedom. The architects of the neoliberal order set out in the 1980s and 1990s to dismantle everything that the New Deal order had built across its 40-year span. Now it too is being dismantled. Establishing a political order demands far more than winning an election or two. It requires deep-pocketed donors to invest in promising candidates over the long term. It requires the establishment of think tanks and policy networks to turn political ideas into actionable programs. It requires a rising political party able to consistently win over multiple electoral constituencies and gain decisive victories at the polls in election after election. It requires a capacity to shape political opinion both at the highest levels, think the Supreme Court, and across legacy and new media. And it requires, finally, a moral perspective able to inspire voters with visions of a good life. Political orders, in other words, are complex projects that require advances across a broad front. New ones do not arise very often. Usually they appear when older orders founder amid an economic crisis that then precipitates a governing crisis. Stagflation precipitated the fall of the New Deal order in the 1970s. The global financial crash and the ensuing recession of 2008-2009 triggered the fracturing of the neoliberal order in the 2010s. A key attribute of a political order is the ability of its ideologically dominant party to bend the opposition party to its will. Bending of this sort comes to be perceived as necessary within the ranks of politicians competing for the top prizes in American politics. Thus, the Republican Party of Dwight D. Eisenhower acquiesced to the core principles of the New Deal order in the 1950s, and the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton accepted the central principles of Reagan's neoliberal order in the 1990s. Acceptance is never complete. There are always points of tension and vulnerability. And yet the success of a political order depends on its proficiency in shaping what broad majorities of elected officials and voters on both sides of the partisan divide regard as politically possible and desirable. By the same token, losing the capacity to exercise ideological hegemony signals a political order's decline. In these moments of decline, political ideas and programs formerly regarded as radical, heterodox, or unworkable, or dismissed as the product of the overheated imaginations of fringe groups on the right and the left, are able to move from the margins into the mainstream. This happened in the 1970s when the breakup of the New Deal order allowed long-scorned neoliberal ideas for reorganizing the economy to take root. It happened again in the 2010s when the coming apart of the neoliberal order opened up a space for Trump-style populism and Sanders-style socialism to flourish. Trump-style populism was unimaginable in the 1990s. Bernie-style socialism was not unimaginable, but no one believed it in the 1990s. In other words, ideas on the margins during periods of ideological hegemony, they don't matter. They can't get into the mainstream, but when a political order is coming apart, they have a chance to bid for influence and legitimacy and sometimes for triumph. Now, a few words about the word or the term neoliberalism, which I'm trying to popularize. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. In the United States, conservatism has been the preferred term to frame the political developments that describe what I refer to as neoliberalism. Why then label the political order that dominated America in the late 20th and early 21st centuries a neoliberal one rather than a conservative one? That choice deserves some explanation. Conservatism in the classical sense signifies respect for tradition, deference to existing institutions and the hierarchies that structure them, and suspicion of change. One can find manifestations of conservatism in American politics across the second half of the 20th century, most importantly in a widespread determination among white Southerners to maintain racial privilege in the era of civil rights, and among Americans throughout the country who, in the name of tradition, were pushing back against liberation movements, calling for equal rights for women and gays and for sexual freedom. Those pushing against the liberation movements should be described as conservatives. Other beliefs commonly associated with conservatism in America, however, do not fit comfortably under this political label. A celebration of free market capitalism, entrepreneurialism, and economic risk-taking were central to Republican Party politics of the late 20th century. Yet this politics was not about maintaining tradition or the institutions that buttressed it. Rather, it was about disrupting traditions and upending institutions that stood in the way. Neoliberalism calls explicitly for unleashing capitalism's power. Central to the politics of the Clinton years were major neoliberal legislative packages that fundamentally restructured America's information, communication, and financial systems, and whose influence on 20th century political economy has been decisive. The aims of the Clinton reforms were to free IT, to free new media, to free e-commerce industry. Think Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Fox, to free them from constraint. Let these institutions develop without government oversight, and let Wall Street run free of government regulation as well. To that end, Clinton repealed the strict regulatory scheme that Democrats had put in place in the 1930s to govern what was then considered to be an ungovernable and excessively speculative Wall Street. Yet these restructurings, which have been profound and affect us every day of our lives, have attracted less attention than they deserve, their significance hidden by the smoke generated by the fiery culture wars of the 1990s. Those culture wars could not be ignored any more than the racial backlash against the civil rights movement can be slighted. But it is time to bring the project of economic transformation more into focus, to give it the kind of careful examination it deserves, and to adjust our views of late 20th century America accordingly. The underlying aim here was to set the underlying aim of neoliberalism was to set capitalism free, to let markets reign supreme, to allow capitalists to make investments without having to worry about government restrictions or oversight. The neoliberal creed prizes entrepreneurial freedom and free trade, celebrates deregulation as an economic good, and valorizes cosmopolitanism as a cultural achievement, the product of open borders and the consequent voluntary mixing of large numbers of diverse peoples. It hails globalization as a win-win proposition that both enriches the West while also bringing an unprecedented level of prosperity to the rest of the world. These creedal principles deeply shaped American politics across the presidencies of Reagan and Clinton, the heyday of the neoliberal order. If these principles sound to some of you a lot like classical 18th century liberalism, think Adam Smith, well, that's because they were. Classical liberalism discerned in markets extraordinary dynamism and possibilities for generating trade, wealth, and a rising standard of living. It sought to liberate markets from monarchy, mercantilism, bureaucracy, artificial borders, and tariffs. It sought, in other words, to release the economy from the heavy hand of the state in its various guises. It wanted to allow people to move around in pursuit of self-interest and fortune. Classical liberalism wanted to let individual talent rise or fall to its natural level. It carried within it emancipatory, even utopian hopes of people freed and a world transformed. This was an ambitious project, and I think the word conservatism cannot capture it. As a scholar and as a historian, as a citizen, I pay careful attention to the harsh elements of neoliberalism, including mechanisms of coercion. It advocated to impose market discipline on a society, support sometimes ruthless for pursuing capitalist accumulation, and an indifference to questions of economic equality and redistribution. But an elite-driven model for understanding neoliberalism cannot suffice to account for the popularity that its views achieved in the United States. Ronald Reagan convinced many Americans that joining his political crusade would unshackle the economy from regulation and make them free. He framed that freedom as every American's birthright. The pursuit of that freedom, he argued, was the reason the American Revolution had been fought, the reason the American nation had come into existence. Reagan resuscitated the emancipatory language of classical liberalism for a late 20th century audience, an act of recovery that helped to make him one of America's most popular political figures. The international origins and reach of neoliberalism have been well documented by a variety of scholars. Generally missing from those studies, however, is a reckoning with the Soviet Union and of communism more generally. I want to spend a few moments reckoning with the importance of the Soviet Union and the communist ideology that powered it. Few international events in the 20th century matched the Russian Revolution of 1917 in importance. In the 50 years after their rise to power in Russia, communists walled off large parts of the world, the vast Soviet Union itself, then half of Europe, and then China, from capitalist economics. For the first third of the Cold War, communism was a serious threat to Western Europe. For the first two-thirds of the Cold War, it posed a similar threat across innumerable nations emerging in Africa and Asia and across Latin America. Meanwhile, in the United States, from the 1920s forward, communism was regarded as a mortal threat to the American way of life. The Great Depression and the Second World War moderated America's anti-communism, but only temporarily. No other single political force had a comparable influence on the world or on American politics across the 20th century. The power of and the fear unleashed by the communist threat is now largely forgotten. When I teach students about the Cold War, they regard it as, well, quaint. They don't understand its power and how much it was the center of everything. But the consequences of the Soviet Union's fall between 1989 and 1991 and the simultaneous defeat of its legitimating ideology were immense, making possible neoliberalism's America and global triumph. One consequence of communist fall is obvious. It opened a large part of the world, Russia and Eastern Europe, to capitalist penetration. It also dramatically deepened the willingness of China, still nominally a communist state, to experiment with capitalist economics. Capitalism thus became global in the 1990s in a way that it had not been since prior to the First World War. Another consequence of communism's fall may be less obvious, but is of equal importance. It removed what had been an imperative in America and elsewhere for compromise between capitalist elites and the working classes. From the 1930s through the 1960s, communism was understood through the lens of totalitarianism. A nation once lost to communism would never be regained for the capitalist world, or so the influential theory of totalitarianism taught. Thus, the specter of communist advance required a policy of military containment unprecedented in American history. It also required the United States to offer generous welfare policies, to implement a steeply progressive taxation system. Those in the highest brackets were paying taxes in excess of 90%. It impelled the government to redistribute from the rich to the poor and to empower labor unions in negotiations with their employers. Why were these generous pro-worker policies required? So as to convince American workers that American capitalism offered them a brighter future than the one that the Soviet Union was offering its citizens. The fear of communism made possible the class compromise between capital and labor that underwrote the New Deal order and similar agreements in many social democracies in Europe after the Second World War. The precise timing of the fall of the Soviet Union and of communism more generally, 1989 to 91, explains why the 1990s were a more decisive decade in neoliberalism's triumph than the 1980s had been, and why Clinton's role in securing neoliberalism's triumph was in some ways more important than that of Reagan himself. After 1991, the pressure on capitalist elites and their supporters to compromise with the working class vanished. The room for political maneuver by class-based progressive forces narrowed dramatically. This was the moment when neoliberalism transitioned from a political movement to a political order. How are we to evaluate the neoliberal order's success? Ideologically, it dominated American politics for about 30 years. During this time, many in America subscribed to its animating and alluring dream, released economic energies from government constraints. If countries did so, then the wealth of nations would rise to extraordinary heights. In the United States, both Republicans and Democrats embraced this vision, not just Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, but also Bill Clinton and even to some extent Barack Obama. The neoliberal order delivered on some of its promises, most notably in globalizing free trade and in raising up middle classes of ample size and security in broad swaths of the developing world. But the stimulation of economic growth in these countries often stripped it away from the global north. Between the 1980s and 2010s, countries in the global north, including the United States, hemorrhaged millions of manufacturing jobs to the global south, to the point where whole industries, textiles, steel, electrical machinery, electronics, chemical products, and so on, were hollowed out, as were the cities and regions in America in which these industries once flourished. The declining fortunes of the working classes of the global north in the 21st century have been well documented. In the United States, intergenerational social mobility had been a hallmark of economic and social life since the 1940s, especially for white working class Americans. Children in these families could expect to improve on their parents' educational attainment, labor force skills, and economic standing. These indicators of upward social mobility all reversed in the 1990s. The younger generation, and here we're coming to you, the younger generation here, the younger generation began falling short of their parents' achievements. By the 2010s, what the economists Angus Deaton and Ann Case have called deaths of despair, deaths arising from alcoholism, drugs, and suicide, began to soar among white, male, middle-aged Americans, triggering a historical reversal in life expectancy across this cohort that had never been seen anywhere in the world before. Despair increasingly mixed with anger, especially at the divergent class outcomes of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. If at that time you were from a prosperous family with assets in the stock market, you had pretty much recovered your losses from the financial crisis by 2010 or 2011. If you were from a poor or working class family, entirely dependent for your economic welfare on wages, you were still struggling to reach pre-2008 levels of income and economic security a full 10 years later. The inequalities generated by neoliberalism were compounded by the inequalities embedded in America's strategy for economic recovery. Not a single banker who had brought on the financial crash of 2008-2009 for engaging in questionable financial practices went to jail. Not a single banker No such generosity was extended to the millions of Americans who lost their homes as a result of the collapsing housing market. Despair mixed with smoldering anger at the profound inequalities that the neoliberal order had unleashed. Someone just needed to throw a match on that smoldering heap of anger. Who do you think it was? The man who tossed the match was someone named Donald J. Trump. His election in 2016 was seismic, an earthquake, not just experienced as such, it will be remembered as such, a profound rebuke to the elites of both parties. No one had expected Trump to win in 2016, not even Trump himself. 10 years later, he has fashioned himself into what he is, the most important political figure in America and the world in the 21st century. It is often hard to discern a consistent political program and meet the heat and smoke that the Trump firestorm has generated over the years, but let us try. There were, in fact, two such programs issuing from the Trump administration during his first term in office. One pointed in the direction of maintaining the neoliberal order, the other in the direction of dismantling it. One pointed, a desire to maintain the neoliberal order was apparent in Trump's program to cut taxes and deregulate industries. Both initiatives meant to free the private economy from government regulation and redistribution, long a core neoliberal goal. If deregulation and tax cuts pointed toward the maintenance of a neoliberal order, however, Trump's assault on free trade and immigration aimed at its destruction. In Trump's eyes, free trade among nations was harming America. So was the free movement of people across national borders. Trump wanted to build walls against both and to allow into America only those goods and individuals that it wanted and under conditions of its own choosing. Trump's ambition to destroy these pillars of the neoliberal order proved to be the more important and more enduring of his political project across his first and now across, thus far, his second term. Trump also seized every opportunity in his first term to remove America from the international position it had long held as a leader of a globalizing and free trade world. He criticized Europe both for taking advantage of the United States in trade and for being unwilling to pay a fair share of the costs of maintaining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He became the first president to publicly question the value of NATO and the close relations between Europe and North America that this multinational defense organization was meant to sustain. He supported Brexit less out of enthusiasm for a fully independent Britain than out of a desire to hurt the European Union, the sort of globalist and cosmopolitan federation that Trump despised. He mused about withdrawing American troops from South Korea, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Trump discovered that he could authorize tariffs unilaterally without the cooperation of Congress if he claimed they enhanced national security. Part of Trump's pitch was that free trade had benefited only the globalists. In an ad released in the final days of the 2016 presidential campaign, Trump had proclaimed that a global power structure had, quote, robbed our working class, stripped our country of its wealth, and put that money into the pockets of a handful of large corporations and political entities. Trump promised that his presidency would upend that power structure and substitute for it one that benefited ordinary Americans. How much Trump really wanted to help America's working class is, of course, open to question. But Trump's constant talk of putting tariffs on imports and on stopping the free movement of people across borders had the effect of widening the space in which those engaged in politics could think more freely and ambitiously about the proper role of government in economic life. If the government could shape markets via tariffs and immigration restriction, might there be other ways in which the government could exercise authority over the economy? Perhaps the government could exercise its power to break up social media and e-commerce companies, or perhaps it could use the power of government to shape the economy in America so that it benefited the many as well as the few. The person who made this argument most effectively was Bernie Sanders, the socialist senator from Vermont, who shocked Hillary Clinton with the energy and sophistication of his challenge to her in 2016. More and more, the 20-teens were coming to resemble the 1930s and 1970s, earlier moments when the decline of the dominant political order had allowed ideas long consigned to the periphery of American politics to move into the mainstream. If the ability to control the ideological mainstream was a sign of a political order's triumph, the loss of that ability signaled a political order's decline. The rise of Trump, Sanders, and others signaled that the neoliberal order was on its heels. What will replace it? The Democrats thought they had found an answer in Joe Biden. Remember him? Biden quickly broadcast his desire to break decisively from his Democratic predecessors in the White House. He is forgotten now, but my message to you today is that don't forget him too soon or too quickly. He followed Sanders in arguing that America was at an inflection point, that the Democratic politics inherited from Clinton and Obama no longer sufficed, and that the moment demanded thinking big and acting boldly. His signature policies in his first term all broke from neoliberalism. They spoke instead of the need to constrain market freedom with government power. His administration made the biggest investments in infrastructure since the New Deal. His policies powerfully incentivized the private sector to reshore manufacturing and to accelerate the green transition. He was determined to re-embrace the conviction that had once made the New Deal order so popular and powerful, namely that the government must regulate capitalism so as to serve the public interest. I don't need to tell you that the Biden project, at least in the short term, has failed. The primary culprit was COVID. Throughout his term, the difficulties of restarting an economy that COVID had compelled the government to shut down dominated public consciousness, leading many to sour on those in charge. Much of the disenchantment with Biden was rooted in pandemic realities over which his administration had, in truth, little control. The loss of loved ones to COVID, long stretches of enforced personal isolation, and the disruption of supply chains that contributed to the worst inflationary spike in 50 years. Though by multiple measures, the US economy rebounded well in 2023 and 2024, to the point where it became the envy of many foreign leaders and observers, majorities of Americans were convinced otherwise. As infirmities of age stripped Biden of the ability to be an effective communicator for his own achievements, many began to look with rose-colored glasses at the halcyon days of the pre-COVID portion of the Trump presidency, forgiving Trump for his refusal to accept his 2020 defeat and conveniently ignoring his role in fomenting the January 6th assault on the Capitol. These Americans carried Trump to victory in 2024. What has he done since then? A lot. He has used in time his office to further distance America from its neoliberal principles. He has imposed high tariffs on most imports to the US, scuttling the neoliberal world of free trade in the process. He wants to dismantle the regime of international law and multilateral organizations that undergirded both the New Deal and the neoliberal orders. The EU has once again drawn his ire. He continues to talk openly about pulling the US out of NATO, part of his attempt to deglobalize not just the international system of free trade, but the earth-spanning military shield that the US has erected to protect such trade. Trump is as intent as ever on closing America's southern border and on bringing illegal immigration to a halt, while narrowing the streams of legal migration to the US. As before, he wants MAGA to turn America into an impregnable fortress, turning away all but the choicest immigrants. If Trump is adhering to principles announced during his first term, he has become far more disciplined about implementing them. He has a team led by Stephen Miller and Russell Vought that spent its time out of power strategizing how to make the most of presidential authority should their man regain the White House again. Trump's shock and awe first 100 days, and the blizzard of executive orders that lie at its core owe a great deal to Miller's and Vought's blitzkrieg battle plans. They're offensive, they're aided by Elon Musk's willingness to come on board and deploy a team of Doge commandos to blow up large portions of what Trump likes to call the deep state. Musk's alliance with Trump was never going to last, but the rest of Trump's team is devoted to him, with Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, who we never hear anything about, which is part of her brilliance, providing administrative competence and calm behind the scenes. Trump has purged his administration of Republican establishment figures who populated the executive branch in the first term. Those establishment figures included men like General Mark Kelly, Trump's chief of staff, men like Gary Cohn, his chief economic advisor from Goldman Sachs, men like General Jim Mattis, his Secretary of Defense. Those kind of men are nowhere to be found in the current White House and cabinet. Trump has taken care to populate his administration exclusively with those profoundly and deeply devoted to him. His ambitions and impulses now reign supreme. Will Trump unbound succeed in building a new political order with the staying power of its Rooseveltian and Reaganite predecessors? It is not yet clear. The chaos, unpredictability, and lack of governing skill of Trump's first term have reappeared in the second. Moreover, the electoral coalition that put Trump back into office is larger and more diverse than Trump 1.0, generating internal conflict on key policy issues. Take tariffs, for example. Part of Trump's pro-tariff lobby is genuinely populist in the sense that it believes that reshoring manufacturing will generate better jobs and greater opportunity for working class Americans. Orrin Cass of the American Compass and Julius Krein, editor of American Affairs, speak for this populist, or what they call economic nationalist wing of MAGA. So does Steve Bannon. Their supporters are strong in various government agencies. But in Congress, a core of Republicans, the last of the neoliberals, care most, and in some cases exclusively, about tax cuts and deregulation. Tariffs appeal to them not because they may revive working class fortunes, but because they will generate external revenue large enough to facilitate a major income tax for the wealthy within American society. Is Trump capable of managing a political coalition of tax cutters and economic nationalists, of upper class and working class constituents? Or will the divergent interests of these distinct groups cause MAGA movement to splinter? Finally, Trump seems little interested in replicating a crucial feature of the political orders that Roosevelt and Reagan established, namely winning a smashing political victory at the polls. Even though he claims a smashing victory at the polls, he has not yet achieved one. The crucial elections that established these earlier political orders were not the ones that first brought these men to power. They were the second elections that returned Roosevelt to power in 1936 and Reagan to power in 1984. In both cases, the margins of the electoral victories in 1936 and 1984 were extraordinary. Each man won nearly 60% of the popular vote, 6-0. Each man won, are you sitting down? You're sitting down. 98% of the electoral college. These were the elections that sealed these earlier movements as political orders. In other words, they dramatically expanded their base and appeal from the first election to the second. The magnitude of these victories is what caused the political opposition, Republicans in the case of Roosevelt, Democrats in the case of Reagan, to fall into disarray and to acquiesce for years to the core political economic principles of the winning party. To achieve this kind of victory for himself or his successor in 2028, Trump might have opted to use his first year back in office to expand his appeal to independents on the one hand and to new groups in his coalition, namely young Latino and African American men. But securing an expanded electoral coalition is not part of Trump's governing plan. Instead, he seems to believe that his victory in 2024 has already given him a mandate to transform every aspect of American life. And indeed, he has been wielding power in breathtaking ways, deporting immigrants without due process, eliminating birthright citizenship, sending federal troops into LA and Washington, D.C., eliminating or drastically reducing agencies authorized by Congress, stripping universities of billions in research funds, ordering the same universities to eliminate all DEI programs, imposing steep tariffs on scores of other countries, firing the leaders and boards of cultural institutions. The list goes on and on. The notion that Trump has a mandate to undertake a transformation of American life of this scope and speed is a fantasy. Trump won the popular vote in 2024 by the slimmest of margins, a mere 1.5%. A switch of a mere 270,000 ballots in a nation of 335 million people would have swung the Electoral College from Trump to Harris and put Harris in the White House. Trump's victory was razor thin. None of the actions he has taken so far have broadened his base of support. To the contrary, those actions are causing him to lose support. So we have to ask why. Why has Trump been so indifferent to expanding his electoral base, so uninterested in following the path blazed by Roosevelt and Reagan to secure their political orders by popular acclaim for a generation or more? Here is where the answer may lie. Trump may believe that he can secure long-term MAGA dominance without expanding his base. Here, the critical influence may not be Roosevelt or Reagan, but one Viktor Orban of Hungary. Orban has kept himself in power for 15 consecutive years by rigging Hungarian politics in his party's favor. He has suppressed free speech, instilled fear in his opponents who go against his wishes and vote for the wrong candidates, compromised the courts, stripped independence away from universities and other civil society institutions. Some of Trump's advisors wish to Orbanize America. They go to Orban and consult with him. They would like to curate the electorate to the point where small margin victories for an incumbent Republican Party are assured. Congress and the courts would be weakened to the point where they can no longer serve as checks on presidential power. In this scenario, America would still have semblances of a democracy. Elections would continue, but not its substance. This may be the future that Trump is imagining, and imagining that occasionally reveals itself when he lightheartedly suggests that many Americans might like to see him assume the powers of a dictator. If he succeeds in this endeavor, Trump will have installed a new political order in America, but one unlike any that preceded it. It will be built on coercion rather than persuasion, on presidential decrees rather than the kind of popular sovereignty that once made America a shining example of democracy in the world. A Trumpian political order, in other words, might well mark the end of America's 250-year experiment in democratic rule. So, what would former Speaker of the House, Mr. Tom Foley, make of this moment? That's what I've been asking myself. We're here in his institute with the furniture from the Speaker's office all around us. He would not like it, to be sure. In musing about, this is all conjecture on my part. I have no special link to his brain. But I remember him, and I remember the kind of politician he was. In musing about how the state of affairs had come to be, Foley might zero in on Congress's failure to put up more of a fight against Trump's power grab. Foley was a congressional lifer, having served as a representative in the House for decades and as Speaker of the House for his last 6 years in office. He believed deeply in Congress's role, not just in representing the people, but in protecting America's system of democratic government. That system rested on dividing federal power equally between three independent branches: the presidency, the Congress, and the courts. Foley understood that this division of powers could get messy and frustrating, but he would have insisted that the founding fathers had been wise in designing such a system. It was a system designed to protect the nation against any one branch of government becoming too powerful. It was designed to prevent government tyranny, secure individual rights, and protect American democracy. Foley would likely wonder why Republican senators have not done more to assert the independence of Congress, to reject cabinet nominees that lacked requisite qualifications, to insist that any changes of the scope that Trump was contemplating be achieved not through presidential decrees, but through congressional legislation. He might point out how in the 1930s and 70s, when Presidents Roosevelt and Nixon went too far in asserting presidential authority, members of the House and Senate on both sides of the aisle rebuked them. members of Congress on both sides of the aisle in the 30s and the 70s rebuked Roosevelt and Nixon when they went too far. The oaths of office taken by these congressmen and senators, which required them to defend the Constitution, demanded nothing less. Why, Foley would want to know in this moment of great peril, has Congress failed to step up for itself and for the American people? And finally, he would underscore the importance of the 2026 election as a referendum on Trump's presidency. To that end, he would insist on doing everything possible to protect this election's integrity. That means ensuring that those possessing the right to vote be able to exercise it, that those voting have reasonable access to polling stations, that voters not be confronted at polling places by National Guard troops sent in by governors or the president to intimidate them, that they be allowed to vote by mail if their state allows it, and that the results of the election be respected, no matter what the outcome. Regardless of what happens in 2026, America will continue down its post-neoliberal path. Whether this path will be a democratic one will depend on how much American citizens, and here I'm talking about all of us, beginning with you, all of you, and me, care to preserve the legacy bequeathed to us by a remarkable political moment 250 years ago. And a small, rather inconsequential group, self-important but rather inconsequential group of colonists parked on the edge of a great empire, dared to imagine a future in which rule by kings would be abolished, in which individuals possess rights that no government could take away, and in which people, the people, would rule. What a great legacy. Are we worthy inheritors of that legacy? And if we are, what are we going to do to protect it and to pass it on to future generations? Thank you very much.
Just stop us right there because it was a tour de force, but we have time for maybe one or two quick questions.
Yes.
So my question is, like, with Congress being so close in both the House and Senate, why are they not doing more to put those checks and balances on the executive branch? It seems like with only needing a few votes from the other party, it should be doable.
In order to do that, it requires not a lot of Republicans, but enough in the Senate to go along with the Democrats, and they would then have a majority. I don't have an answer for you. That's why I'm asking Tom Foley to help, to help me. And some of you have listened to a podcast I did with Reed Galen, who used to be an important figure in the Republican Party. I asked him, I said, where are the Republican senators on this? And to give you an example that should not be controversial, because I understand there may be some Trump supporters here, it may be that on some issues you have strong feelings that Trump just has to power through. But the notion that the entire world of trade can be upended through the decrees of one man is crazy and is so injurious to the prerogatives of Congress. The Federalist Society, no friend to the Democrats, they are conservative, are appalled by this, the idea that you can upend a whole world of trade simply by decrees, and that you don't need a peace. How do you do this the right way? If you want to change America's relationship to the world through tariffs, run it through Congress. And clearly the Democrats would support this fully. They can't even get a few Republicans to come on side with this. So I'm going to put the question back to you and to all of you, if you have thoughts about why there's fear involved. He owns the party now. They're worried about re-election. So this is a big issue, but courage is missing. Courage is missing, and perhaps it speaks to the depths to which we have fallen in terms of our democratic crisis, that the regard for the Constitution. Listen, the guys who went after Roosevelt in 1937 or 38, the Southern oligarchs who wanted to protect not slavery, but Jim Crow, they were not angels. But when, and they operated oligarchically in their home states frequently. But when Roosevelt did something really bad, like pack the court with his Supreme Court, with his appointees, they said, no, you're not doing that. And they punished him in the 1938 election. In the 1970s, Republican and Democratic legislators went to Nixon and said, you have to resign, because otherwise we're not going to just impeach you, we're going to remove you from office. That kind of regard for the system of government, the Constitution, has been drained out of Congress. And that is what, in a sense, I'm most worried about. Yes, back there.
There's been two events on the actually Democrat side of this, which may relate. I'm sure you can relate it to. But the first one would be Zoran Mamdani's
Zoran Mamdani.
victory in New York over the Democratic establishment, and the Trump-like rhetoric coming out of California's governor Newsom. How would that is that like kind of a signaling, like a kind of final death throw of neoliberalism on the Democrat side?
Yes. Certainly Mamdani in New York is post-neoliberal, and he's on the left, and he has a vision in which government should play a much more prominent role in the private economy for the sake of the public interest. He's a very good example of how far that has come. It's not clear how far Newsom has moved on the questions of neoliberalism, the relationship of government to the economy. Where he has moved is to just be clear that the democratic character of America ought to be preserved. I feel confident that we're going to have a post-neoliberal economy. The question is whether it's going to be an authoritarian one or a democratic one. So I don't think Newsom is signaling the death of post-neoliberalism, but he's grasped the importance of this moment and the importance of protecting our inheritance. And in order to protect, we're in trouble. And in order to protect that, all of us as citizens have to find ways to act.
I am so sorry I have to, because this is a great discussion, but our time is up. Before I ask you in joining me in thanking our speaker today, let me remind you, this series goes on the rest of the semester. Our next event is a week from today, same time, same place. We have Jeff Kopstein from University of California, Irvine, talking about deconstructing the deep state, if you believe in the deep state, or deconstructing the state if you don't believe in the deep state. So, and that will be a great lecture as well. But this was a brilliant way to start off the series. So appreciative that you came out. Join me now in thanking.
Apologies for the length, and I will make myself available just in the hallway outdoors.